My name is Wesley Hartman. I'm 64 years old. I've fixed broken pipes in January frost with bare hands. I've raised a son alone after his mother walked out without a note. I've outlasted things that would have finished most men twice my size. But nothing prepared me for the silence. My son Theodore hadn't picked up his phone in 3 days. Now Theodore is a lot of things: stubborn, proud, sometimes too quiet for his own good. But he has always picked up when I called. Even during our worst arguments, even the year we barely spoke, even then, he picked up. 3 days of nothing broke something loose inside me. So I drove. 3 hours. Pre-dawn dark. Coffee going cold in the cup holder. Rehearsing what I'd say when I got there. Something calm. Something that didn't sound like panic, even though my hands weren't quite steady on the wheel. When I used the emergency key he'd given me years ago, only for real emergencies, Dad, and pushed that front door open, the silence hit me like a physical thing. And then the closet moved. What I found behind that door didn't just change what I knew about my son's life, it changed what I knew about mine. There was a name written in red marker on a folder buried inside that closet, a name that made my blood go very, very cold. Vivian Cross. I knew that name. The question was, how did she know my son? Stop. Before this story goes 1 second further, subscribe right now and hit the bell, because what happens inside that closet is only the beginning. The twist in this story is the kind that makes you replay everything you just heard, like this video. Drop Wesley in the comments if you're already hooked, and let's see how many of us make it to the end together. Don't scroll, don't skip. You'll regret missing what comes next. I want to tell you something about fathers and silence. When your child is small, 2, 3, 4 years old, silence is the most dangerous sound in the house. Every parent knows it. Stop thinking that way. Theodore stopped thinking that way. Theodore is 34 years old. He runs his own consulting firm. He owns his home. He drives a sensible car and keeps a savings account that would make my younger self weep with envy. By every visible measure, my son is a man who figured it out. But I am still his father. And when the silence came, my body knew before my mind caught up. It was Tuesday. Ordinary in every way. I'd called to talk about Thanksgiving. Nothing urgent, just the kind of call fathers make when the calendar reminds them that the year is slipping again. I'll let it ring. Got his voicemail. Theodore's voice, professional and warm. You've reached Theodore Hartman. Leave a message and I'll get back to you. I left a message, kept it light. Just checking in, Theo. Call me when you get a minute. He didn't call. I told myself he was busy. Theodore runs a tight operation with 2 junior partners and a client list that keeps him moving. A missed call meant nothing. I called again Wednesday evening. Voicemail, I sent a text, a simple one. You okay? The kind a father sends when he's trying not to sound like he's worried when he absolutely is. The 2 little check marks appeared, delivered. They never turned blur. He never opened it. By Thursday morning, something inside my chest had shifted into a gear I hadn't used in years. I called Silas, Theodore's neighbor, a man I've known since Theo moved into that townhouse 4 years ago. Silas is the kind of man who notices things, keeps to himself but notices things. He picked up on the second ring. Silas, I said, have you seen Theodore this week? There was a pause, not a long one, but just long enough. I haven't seen his car move in a few days, Wesley, but I'm sure he's fine. Fine. I've lived 64 years on this earth, and I have learned that when someone says fine in that particular tone, careful, a little too quick, slightly airless, they mean anything but. I thanked Silas and hung up. Then I sat in my kitchen for a long moment, looking at the coffee going cold in front of me, and I made a decision. I was going. I left before 5 a.m. The roads were dark and mostly empty. I drove with the radio low because something about music felt wrong. Felt like it was covering a sound I needed to hear. I stopped once for gas and stood outside in the cold for a minute, just breathing, telling myself the stories fathers tell. He's fine. He needed space. He's overwhelmed with work. He'll answer when you get there and laugh at you for driving 3 hours in the dark. I told myself those stories all the way to his street. His townhouse sat dark and still. The porch light was off. His car was in the driveway. That detail landed wrong immediately, because Theodore keeps that car as clean as an argument, and there were leaves across the hood that had clearly been there for days. The mail slot was overflowing. I stood on the porch for a moment with the emergency key in my hand, the one he gave me 3 years ago when he first bought the place. He'd handed it over with that particular Theodore expression, half reluctant, half relieved, and said, "Only for real emergencies, Dad." I thought about whether this counted. I decided it did. The door opened into darkness. I reached for the light switch and stood there in his hallway, and the quiet pressed in from every direction. His jacket was on the hook. His keys were on the table. He was home. He was simply not answering. My mouth went dry. And then, from down the hall from the bedroom, I heard it. Something shifted behind the door. Something moved. I want to be precise about what I felt in that hallway. It wasn't fear exactly. Something older than fear. Primal, cellular thing. The same feeling I got when Theodore was 7 and fell out of a backyard tree and went quiet instead of crying. Quiet instead of crying is always worse. Any parent will tell you that. I moved toward the bedroom slowly. I don't know why slowly. Some instinct I couldn't name. The bedroom door was half open. I pushed it the rest of the way. The room was dim, curtains drawn, bed unmade, which alone told me something because Theodore makes his bed every morning without exception. A habit I drilled into him so thoroughly it became part of his character. The room smelled stale, lived in and sealed off at the same time. And there, on the floor in front of the closet door slightly ajar, was my son. Theodore James Hartman, 34 years old, broad-shouldered, always well put together, the kind of man who irons his shirts on Sunday nights for the week ahead. Sitting on the hardwood floor with his knees pulled to his chest and his headphones in and his eyes closed. He hadn't heard me come in. I stood there for a moment that felt much longer than it was, looking at my son folded up on the floor like something had pressed him down and he hadn't quite been able to get back up. I crouched down and put my hand on his shoulder. He came out of the headphones with a gasp, scrambling backward until he hit the closet door, and for one split second his eyes were pure animal panic. And then they landed on me, and something moved across his face that broke a specific particular part of my heart. It was shame, not surprise, not relief, not even embarrassment. Shame. Deep and practiced, like he'd been wearing it for a while. "Dad." His voice came out rough and low. "You weren't supposed to come here." I looked at my son. I looked at the closet behind him. Door nudged open now, and I could see inside it. Boxes. dozens of them stacked with Theodore's careful architectural precision. Folders, files, a paper trail of something I hadn't been invited to see. And one folder, sitting slightly apart from the others, labeled in red marker, Vivian Cross, do not open. I didn't ask about it yet, not immediately. Instead, I did something that surprised us both. I sat down on the floor next to him, right there on the cold hardwood. Two grown men in a dim bedroom, leaning against a closet full of secrets. Start from the beginning, I said. All of it. I've got nowhere to be. Theodore stared at the floor for a long time, and then he started to talk. It came out in pieces the way confessions always do, not chronologically, not cleanly, but in the order that shame releases things, slowly, painfully. 2 years ago, Theodore had taken on a business partner, a woman named Vivian Cross. She came recommended through a professional network, sharp and experienced, specializing in client acquisition and contract management. Everything above board, everything documented. Theodore had done his due diligence, or thought he had. What he didn't know, what he couldn't have known without knowing where to look, was that Vivian Cross had a pattern. Over the past 2 years, she had been quietly, systematically redirecting client payments from Theodore's company accounts into accounts he didn't control. She had forged his signature on 3 separate contract amendments. She had restructured 2 client relationships entirely, on paper using his name, and siphoned the difference. And she had done it all in a way that, if anyone looked at the documents without context, made Theodore look like the one stealing. He'd discovered it 6 weeks ago. He'd spent those 6 weeks trying to figure out what to do, who to tell, whether he could fix it quietly before it became something he couldn't contain. He hadn't told me because, and this is the part I keep coming back to, the part I will probably turn over in my mind for the rest of my life. He was afraid I would see him as a failure. Me. His father. The man who worked construction for 30 years so Theodore could have opportunities I never had. He was afraid that if I knew someone had done this to him, I would love him less for it. I sat with that for a moment. Then I put my hand on the back of his neck the way I used to when he was small and overwhelmed and couldn't find the words for what was wrong. Listen to me, I said quietly. Someone did this to you. You understand the difference? He didn't answer, but his jaw stopped being quite so tight. I looked at the folder in the closet. Vivian Cross. That name, I said slowly. Vivian Cross. Something was pulling at the back of my memory, something distant and cold, like a draft from a window you forgot you left open. I knew that name. I just couldn't yet remember how. I sat with that folder in my hands for a long time before I opened it. Theodore had fallen quiet beside me, that particular quiet of a man who has finally said the thing he's been holding and now has nothing left to do but wait and see what it costs him. He watched me with the folder the way people watch doctors read test results, not breathing quite right, hands too still. I turned it over once. Vivian Cross, do not open. I opened it. Inside were documents, bank statements with figures that made my stomach tighten, contracts with Theodore's signature on them. Or what was supposed to be his signature, slightly off in a way that only made sense now that I knew what I was looking at. Client correspondence, routing numbers, a paper architecture of something built carefully over 2 years to look like one thing and be entirely another. And photographs, professional headshots, printed on plain paper. A woman in her mid-40s, dark-haired, composed. The kind of face that reads as trustworthy at first glance. Open eyes, easy smile. The kind of face that has probably spent years learning to read exactly as trustworthy. I stared at that photograph, and something in the back of my memory, that cold draft I'd felt earlier, became a wide open window. I knew this woman. Not well, not recently, but I knew her. 20 years ago, I was still working in construction management. I had an associate, a man named Gerald Fitch, who ran a mid-sized material supply company. We weren't close friends, but we moved in the same professional circles, shared the occasional dinner, the occasional handshake on a job site. Gerald was a decent man, a little too trusting, a little too impressed by sharp people who spoke with confidence. He married a woman briefly, a woman I met twice at company dinners. Her name then was Vivian Mercer. She asked too many questions and remembered every answer. I had noticed it at the time, the way she cataloged information, the way her attention sharpened around financial conversations. I had mentioned it to Gerald once, gently, the way you do when you're not sure if you're reading something correctly or just being uncharitable to someone you don't know well. Gerald hadn't listened. The marriage ended 18 months later in a financial dispute that nearly took his company with it. I set the photograph down on the floor between Theodore and me. Theodore, I said carefully, this woman didn't find you through a professional network. He looked at me. She came looking, I said. Specifically, I don't know yet how she connected us, but I know who she is, and I know you are not the first. The color left my son's face. I picked up my phone and called Silas. He answered on the third ring, cautious, like he'd been expecting this call and dreading it. Silas, I said, I need you to tell me what you actually know. Another one of those pauses, longer this time. Then, Wesley, I didn't want to get involved. I'm not asking you to get involved. I'm asking you to tell me what you saw. What came out of him then had clearly been seizing badly for weeks. About a month ago, Silas had seen a woman matching Vivian's description at Theodore's office building. Not during business hours, not in any configuration that looked like normal professional activity. It was past midnight. There were boxes. A car he didn't recognize, parked with the trunk open. He'd assumed it was a difficult breakup. A woman removing her things from a shared professional space. He hadn't wanted to inject himself into Theodore's personal life. I thanked him. I told him I understood. I meant it. I hung up and wrote one word in the Notes app on my phone. Ren. Theodore had mentioned the name 20 minutes earlier, almost as an aside, a former colleague of Vivian's who had tried once vaguely to warn him over coffee about a year ago. He hadn't known what to do with the warning at the time. It had seemed abstract, unprovable, the kind of thing that felt unfair to act on. I looked at Theodore now. I need Ren's number, I said. Dad, I don't think... Her number, Theo. He found it. He handed it over. I looked at it for a moment and thought about Gerald Fitch, 20 years ago, with his too trusting face and his company that almost didn't survive. I thought about the way Vivian Cross had looked at company dinners, cataloging, remembering, and I thought about my son on this floor, folded up with someone else's damage pressing him down. She picked the wrong family, I thought. She just doesn't know it yet. I drove to meet Ren alone. Theodore had wanted to come. I understood why. It was his life, his company, his name on those forged documents. But I needed the conversation to be clean. When Theodore was in the room, Everything ran through the filter of his shame, his anger, his exhaustion. I needed facts without that weight on them, at least for this first meeting. We met at a diner 40 minutes from Theodore's townhouse. Wren's choice. Neutral ground, she'd said on the phone when I called, which told me immediately that she'd been thinking about neutral ground for a while. She was already there when I arrived. Late 40s, small framed, with the precise posture of someone who has spent years making herself take up less space than she should. She was nursing a black coffee and she did not smile when I sat down across from her. I appreciated that. I wasn't in a smiling situation. "You're Wesley," she said. Not a question. "I am." "You found the closet." I looked at her carefully. "How did you know about the closet?" "Because Theodore told me 6 weeks ago that he'd started keeping everything there. Said it was the one place he felt like he had control of the documentation." She wrapped both hands around her mug. "I've been waiting for someone to show up. I just thought it would be Theodore." "Theodore isn't in a showing up place right now," I said. "I am." She studied me for a moment. Then she nodded, once, as if I'd passed some quiet test she hadn't announced she was administering. "Vivian Cross has done this 3 times, she said. The diner noise went on around us. Dishes, conversation, the low hum of a television above the counter, and none of it touched our table. Wren had worked adjacent to Vivian 4 years ago at a consulting firm in Philadelphia. She'd watched Vivian operate from close range, charming, methodical, unhurried, the kind of person who plants seeds and then waits entire seasons for them to grow before she harvests them. By the time anyone noticed the harvest, she was already somewhere else entirely. The first victim was a small technology startup in Portland. The founder was a 29-year-old who had built something genuinely good and had no reason to expect what Vivian brought with her. She'd embedded herself over 14 months. By the time it was over, the company's accounts were restructured in a way that took 3 accountants and 2 attorneys to untangle. The founder couldn't afford the untangling. The business closed. The second was a family-owned import business in Columbus, Ohio. Father and son operation, 30 years of reputation. Same pattern. Document forgery, redirected funds, the owner's name on contracts he'd never seen. The son had nearly gone to prison before a sympathetic accountant found the routing discrepancy. The case dissolved, but the reputation didn't recover. Theodore was number 3. But here, and this is where Wren's expression shifted into something that looked almost like controlled fury. Here was where Vivian had made a mistake. She'd gotten comfortable. Years of operating cleanly had made her sloppy in one specific way. She'd started recycling infrastructure, using the same bank routing number across all 3 schemes, routed through a holding company that existed only on paper. She'd done it because it worked and because she'd never been caught and because people who never get caught eventually stop being quite as careful. Wren had found it 8 months ago. She'd spent those 8 months building a file, quietly, carefully, without Vivian knowing. She reached into the bag beside her and set a folder on the table between us, thicker than Theodore's, much thicker. "I needed a victim willing to fight," she said simply. "The Portland founder was too broken. The Columbus family was too afraid of drawing more attention to their name. I needed someone with standing, with documentation, and with someone in their corner who understood that this only works if you don't flinch." She looked at me directly for the first time since I'd sat down. "Are you going to flinch, Wesley?" I thought about my son on that floor. I thought about a folder marked do not open that someone had decided my son should be too ashamed to open himself. I thought about Gerald Fitch and a marriage that ended badly and a company that almost didn't survive and a warning nobody listened to 20 years ago. No, I said, I'm not going to flinch. I drove back to Theodore's apartment as the afternoon light was going flat and gray. He was at the kitchen table when I came in, both hands around a coffee mug, staring at nothing. The boxes from the closet were stacked around him now. He'd brought them out while I was gone, I realized. Laid everything open on the table, stopped hiding it, at least from himself. I sat across from him. I set Ren's file next to his. Together, they were something. She's done this before, I told him. You were chosen, targeted, by someone who is very good at this and who has never once faced a consequence for it. Theodore looked at the files. Something moved behind his eyes. Grief, anger, the specific exhaustion of a man who has been carrying something alone for too long. What do we do? He said quietly. I leaned forward. We stop running, I said, starting right now. I want to tell you something about being 64 years old. People assume age slows you down, and in some ways, the knees, the early mornings, the way a bad night's sleep takes 3 days to recover from, they're not wrong. But there is something that age gives you that nobody warns you about when you're young and fast and certain of everything. Patience. Cold, architectural, unshakable patience. I had spent 30 years in construction management. 30 years of watching projects that look impossible become inevitable, not through force, but through sequence. The right action at the right time in the right order. You don't rush a foundation, you don't pour concrete in the wrong weather. You wait, you prepare, you build something that cannot be undone. Vivian Cross had spent years counting on her targets being too ashamed, too panicked, too emotionally overwhelmed to think sequentially. She had never met a man who builds things for a living. The first call I made was to Ursula. Ursula Vance had been a civil litigation attorney for 31 years. I'd known her since a property dispute in 1994 that she'd resolved with 3 pieces of paper and a phone call, so calm it bordered on surgical. She was 58 now, semi-retired, and operated out of a home office that was more organized than most courtrooms I'd seen. When I called her, she was apparently reorganizing her bookshelves, because I could hear the soft thud of volumes being moved while she listened to me without interrupting. I laid out everything. Theodore, Vivian, the forged documents, the redirected accounts, the routing number Ren had identified, the 2 previous victims, the paper file sitting on Theodore's kitchen table that currently represented 2 years of someone else's careful, deliberate destruction. When I finished, there was a brief silence. Then Ursula said, "Send me the file tonight. Both files, Theodore's and Ren's." "That's it?" I said. "That's the start," she said. "And Wesley, tell your son to stop being ashamed. Shame is exactly what she's been counting on this entire time." I passed that on to Theodore word for word. He didn't respond immediately, but I watched something in his posture shift. Almost imperceptible, a degree or 2 away from folded inward towards something more like upright. Ursula worked fast once she had the documents. What she was building wasn't a criminal case. She was clear about that from the beginning, clear about what the evidentiary threshold required and what the civil path could actually deliver faster and more reliably. What she was building was a multi-party civil fraud claim. 3 victims, 1 documented pattern, 1 routing number that tied everything together like a thread, pulled through separate pieces of cloth. She contacted the Portland founder and the Columbus family independently, professionally, without pressure. Both agreed to participate. The Portland founder, Ursula told me afterward, had cried on the phone. Not from sadness, from something that sounded, she said, like the specific relief of not being alone in something anymore. Meanwhile, I made one move of my own, quietly, without telling Ursula until after, because I knew she'd tell me to wait and I wasn't prepared to wait on this particular thing. Vivian had a current client, a small architecture firm in Maryland whose principal partner had recently signed a contract restructuring agreement. One of Vivian's, I was almost certain, designed to begin the same slow redirect she'd run on Theodore. I found the principal through a completely legitimate professional channel. I didn't accuse anyone of anything. I didn't mention Vivian by name in the first conversation. I simply introduced myself as someone with experience in construction and contract management who had recently become aware of some irregularities in a specific type of agreement structure. I asked if he'd had his recent contracts independently reviewed. He hadn't. He did within the week. When Ursula found out, she was quiet for a long moment. Then she said, "Don't do that again without telling me." Then, after another pause, "But it was smart." Through all of this, Theodore watched. He helped where he could, organizing documents, clarifying timelines, answering Ursula's questions with increasing steadiness. There were hard days. Days when the exposure of it all felt like too much, when his name on those forged documents felt like a permanent mark rather than evidence of someone else's crime. One evening he called me and said he wanted to stop. His voice was flat and exhausted, and I recognized the particular sound of a person who has been brave for longer than they expected to have to be. I didn't argue with him. I didn't lecture. I just said, "I drove 3 hours in the dark because your phone went quiet. I'm not going home until your name is clean. You can be scared and still do this, Theodore. I'll be scared right alongside you. That's what I'm here for." Long silence on the line. Then, "Okay, Dad." Just that. "Okay, Dad." Those two words held 34 years of everything we'd ever been to each other. Every silence and every argument and every moment I'd shown up and every moment I'd fallen short and every single morning I'd gotten up and tried again because he existed, and that was reason enough. "Okay, Dad." We didn't stop. The settlement came on a Wednesday morning, not dramatic, not cinematic. Ursula called me while I was making toast and said, "They accepted," in the same tone she might use to confirm a lunch reservation. That's the thing about real justice. It doesn't arrive with music. It arrives like a phone call on an ordinary morning while your bread is still warm. Vivian's attorney had attempted to negotiate 3 times. Ursula declined the first 2 offers without ceremony. The third offer, full financial restitution to all 3 victims, a formal legal record of the fraud pattern, and a professional conduct agreement that effectively ended Vivian's ability to operate under her name in her industry, was accepted. No prison, but no escape either. Everything she had built using other people's lives, other people's names, other people's years of work, gone. The architecture of it dismantled in documents as carefully as she had constructed it, brick by slow brick. I called Theodore when I hung up with Ursula. He didn't say anything for a moment. Then, "It's over. It's over." Another silence. And then he made a sound I hadn't heard since he was maybe 12 years old, when his little league team won a game they had absolutely no business winning. Something between a laugh and an exhale, pure involuntary relief spilling out before he could compose himself around it. That sound was worth every dark mile of that 3-hour drive. 3 weeks later, I was back at his place for dinner. No legal files on the table this time. No boxes from the closet. Just leftover pasta from a recipe he'd clearly found online and executed imperfectly. And garlic bread that was slightly burned on one side, and a bottle of red wine he'd been saving for a good occasion and had apparently decided disqualified. We ate. We talked about nothing important. He told me about a new client, a legitimate one, carefully vetted, someone Ren had actually vouched for through the professional network she was quietly rebuilding for people Vivian had touched. He laughed at something I said, a real laugh, unguarded and easy, the kind that doesn't perform anything. I sat across from my son and thought, this is what I drove for, not Vivian's downfall, not the settlement figure or the legal record or the professional conduct agreement, not even the vindication of being right about a woman I'd warned someone about 20 years too early. This, a kitchen table, bad garlic bread. My son laughing like he had every right to, because he did. There is a letter I wrote to Vivian Cross that I never sent. I wrote it anyway. I needed to say it somewhere, even if only to myself. I don't forgive you for what you took. Not yet. Maybe not ever completely, but I refuse to let what you did live in my chest for whatever years I have left. My son is rebuilding. I watch him do it every day. He answers his phone now. He laughs without checking himself. He's becoming again the man I always knew he was. You picked the wrong family. Not because we're powerful or connected or special in any way that would show up on paper, but because when things went quiet, when my son went silent and the phone rang out and the silence got loud enough to hear from 3 hours away, I got in my car. That's all. I just got in my car. I almost feel sorry for you, Vivian. To have spent this long being that calculated, that careful, that deliberate, and to have never once had someone get in a car for you. Almost. My son went silent for days. I want you to know. He found his voice again. So did I. This is why you stay. This is why you subscribe. If this story moved you, if Wesley and Theodore reminded you of someone you love, or a silence you once had to drive toward, then this community is exactly where you belong. Subscribe now, hit the bell, like this video, share it with someone who needs to hear that justice doesn't always roar. Sometimes it arrives quiet on a Wednesday morning while your toast is still warm. Drop "I got in the car" in the comments, because that's what this whole story was really about. The next story is already waiting. And trust us, you don't want to miss where we're going next. Subscribe. Be here. We'll see you in the next one.